Y continuamos con la agenda académica y el siguiente tema y conferencia, Mercados de Energía Eléctrica antes y después de las nuevas tecnologías energéticas, a cargo del señor Fereidoon Sioshansi, Presidente Menlo Energy Economics. El doctor Sioshansi es presidente de Menlo Energy Economics, una firma consultora con sede en San Francisco que asesora a los clientes sobre las implicaciones de la rápida transformación del sector eléctrico y los modelos de negocios emergentes. Es el editor y editor de Energy Informer, un boletín mensual de circulación internacional. Cuenta con más de 35 años de experiencia, incluyendo trabajo en Southern California, Edison Company, el Instituto de Investigación de Energía Eléctrica, EPRI, National Economic Research Associates y Henwood Energy. Ahora parte de ABB. Desde 2006 ha editado 10 libros publicados por Academic Press. El último titulado Innovación e interrupción en el borde de la red, cómo se distribuyeron los recursos energéticos distribuidos en el modelo de negocio tradicional de servicios públicos. Se publicó en mayo de 2017. Su próximo libro, Consumer Prosumer, cómo las innovaciones de servicio interrumpirán el modelo de negocio de servicios públicos, se publicará a principios de 2019. Es licenciado en Ingeniería y Economía, incluyendo una maestría y un doctorado en Economía de la Universidad de Purdue. Bienvenido, señor Sioshansi.
Thank you very much. Buenas tardes. I think that's about as much Spanish as I can handle. I apologize, but maybe switching back from English to Spanish to English is good, keeps you awake. Anyway, the challenge, speaking at a conference like this on the second day after several other excellent speakers, is that a lot of what I had to say has already been said. So there's a bit of a challenge there, but I'll see what I can come up with to keep you engaged and to maybe add a little bit to the discussion. But before I forget, like everybody else, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me back. I was at Cartagena, I think 4 or 5 years ago, so it's very nice to be back, and I recognize a few of the people in the audience. I'm going to talk about experience that I have traveling in America, Europe, Australia, other countries that are perhaps a bit more into the distributed world and some of the changes that we've been talking about. So, but I'm also very interested to hear your feedback. So to the extent that you agree or disagree with me, I think I'd like to have the feedback. But to start with, I think the theme that has been repeated several times already, I think I'm going to give you my conclusions in the beginning before everybody falls asleep. So the conclusion, the first one, is that I think that as we move forward, the biggest change, if I were pressed to ask for one, is the first bullet, which is the balance of power in the power industry is shifting towards consumers. And the second bullet explains why. There is a lot of assets, basically gadgets, anything that uses energy and performs services is what I call behind the meter. Behind the meter is where a lot of interest and focus, I think, is going to be in the future, and I'll explain why. And the third bullet, which is something I'm now very much interested in terms of research and projects that I'm working on, is basically new players that are coming into this industry whose job will be to develop new business models to make the behind the meter a reality and actually make it profitable business. And I'll give you a little bit of flavor of that. So these are some of the bullets. You know, we talked about virtual power plants. We talked about peer-to-peer trading and things like that. These are now just at the very early stages of development in a number of places. And I think 10 years from now, if we get together again in Cartagena, we can talk about, you know, who started what and which ones succeeded and so forth. So I'm going to talk about those topics more or less in that But before we go forward, I think the challenge is that hopefully by the end of my presentation, you will be able to answer basically these questions. What is behind the meter? Why is it exciting to talk about the behind the meter? And what can be done if you actually develop some of these successful business models? And I'm going to skip some of the presentations, but to give you a flavor of what I've been doing in the last, it's more than, I think the first book on the top, these are the books I've edited since 2006, and you can see the topics have varied. But I'm not here to talk about my books, but to talk about my interest. My interest basically evolved from the one on the extreme, which side of you would be? Left-hand side. I started first looking at distributed generation and what its impact might be in the power sector. That led me to the next volume, which was the same title as the MIT book that Professor Arcus mentioned. Actually, my book and their report came out about the same time. Somewhat duplicative, you might say, but I suggest you read both and tell me which one is more interesting. But then that led me to the book that just came out, I think, earlier. I happen to have a copy of it, basically looking at innovation and disruption at the grid's edge. So I picked those key words to kind of, in fact, I was sitting next to somebody from XM who's looking at strategy and innovation at XM. So that was very fortunate for me to have that book handy. But now I'm finished the next volume, which is moving, I moved from distributed generation to looking at business models, to looking at innovation, and now I'm looking at the consumer, prosumer, and what I call prosumager. And this book should come out in early next year. And believe it or not, I'm now working on one that hopefully will come out in 2020, and that one is titled Behind and Beyond the Meter. I think we're looking at a future where you don't need the meter because of some of the reasons I'll talk about. So I'll skip some of these. But getting into that, I think the last day and a half, people have talked about these three famous Ds. And so I'm not going to belabor them other than kind of laying out the groundwork. Why are these three Ds so important? These are the three important things, I believe, that are making these changes that everybody's talking about happen. And it's happening in different parts of the world at different speed. But where I come from is California, of course. In California, just last month, the governor signed a bill to make the electric sector in California 100% renewable. On the same day, he also signed an executive order, which is not a law, but it's an executive order, so it can be changed by the next governor, for example. But he actually wants the whole economy of California to be carbon neutral by 2045. Now, this is very interesting because California is number 5 or 6 global economy. It's not a small country, so it's very ambitious. And of course, coming to Colombia, you have 82% hydro. And the gentleman who's going to talk after me comes from Norway, where it's 100% renewable already. So what's the big deal about going 100% renewable in California? Well, here's the governor, anyway, at the signing ceremony. The second in the three Ds, of course, is decentralization. The fact that we can now produce power on our rooftop. And this, by the way, is one of my neighbors across the street. We're not talking about 1 or 2 or 4 panels. When people put these on the roof, they just cover the roof. The only open spot is where the skylight is in the kitchen, so the entire roof is covered. Right now in California, we have something like 700,000 of these, about 6 gigawatts of solar capacity, and rapidly growing. Now, that number may sound impressive until you go to Australia, where it has 1 million solar roofs and counting. So this is a reality. People can produce their own power, and in many cases can be a net producer across the entire year. Maybe not all hours or all days, but across the entire And these are some examples from other countries. One of the most interesting is Australia. It's not a large country. It's got something like 28 million people as opposed to about 40 in California. But it already has a higher penetration and higher number of solar. So watch for Australia. If you're looking at change, it's one of the most interesting markets in the world to look at. And of course, people talk about, Professor Arcos talked about the rest of the world. 25% of people across the world don't have any power. And one of the interesting things about this distributed future is that you don't need the massive grid that we have in most of the Western world. You can put solar panels and smart battery and essentially run a small utility, if you will, on your little hut in the middle of nowhere. Examples like this, you can produce power and use it more or less wherever you are, which is very interesting. I went to a wedding recently on a golf course, in a remote golf course, and the whole wedding was an eco-wedding. They produced solar energy to run the speakers and facilities for the wedding. It happened to be a sunny day, otherwise they probably couldn't have done it. But this is the reality. You can produce power wherever there's sunlight. And for example, people are not talking about cars that would have their own solar panels. And if you don't drive very far and you live in a sunny place and you park it in a sunny spot, the car would run most of the time, maybe not all the time. And the third one, Professor talked about how many a trillion points of data collection. Yeah, I mean, this is happening around us, and what does it mean? Who's going to do it? Who's going to collect the data? Who's going to use it? Do we have to be concerned about cybersecurity or hacking? Of course, these are all things we need to be concerned about. Okay, so with those three things out of the way, let's talk a little bit about behind the meter. Why do I think this is the most exciting thing, at least in my business? This is what I'm going to focus on in the next few years. And these are some of the reasons that I think is very exciting. If you go to any textbook of electric power industry and look for a picture, what does this industry look like? You get something like this. You get power plants, transmission lines, distribution lines, transformers, ending at a meter. Well, this is half the story. The exciting things happen on the other side of the meter. We developed this whole network to get to the other side of the meter. What do customers do with the electricity when they actually get it? I think that is really what we need to look at. What is behind the meter? Well, anything that uses energy, electric vehicles, distributed generation, all these things are behind the meter. How big is this market? Well, this is a study done by Bloomberg, again for Australian market, which I think is one of the most interesting to watch. Their projection is something like 40% of generation in Australia will be behind the meter. We're just talking a few years from now. These things are not years away. It's happening. And the reason it's happening in Australia, of course, is several reasons. One is high retail tariffs, a lot of sunshine, a lot of people live in homes with roofs on the top, and people basically don't like to pay the utility if they can produce power on the roof. These are some of the examples or reasons. So 10 years from now or 20 years from now, if you want a textbook example of what the power sector looks like, you'll probably find something like this: a distributed source which is feeding the house or the building, putting some of the excess generation in some sort of storage, not necessarily a battery, and is connected to the network for reliability and resilience and backup, as Professor Varkas correctly pointed out. So the way we look at the industry with all that upstream investments feeding the meter, I think fundamentally is going to change to we looking at the customer and exciting things on the other side of the meter, and then looking at the upstream stuff as, okay, that's interesting too. And that's really where we're heading. Okay, so if you believe at least some of what I'm saying, let's first talk about this, the first step. The first step is consumers become prosumers. As this schematic shows, if you put a lot of solar panels on the roof, and it's a sunny day, you're going to produce more power during certain hours of the day than you use. So you have this blue excess generation. And the gentleman from Craig is no longer here, but this is what's one of the biggest issues facing regulators around the world. What is that blue portion worth? How much should customers be paid if they're selling their excess generation into the network? In many places like California, on a sunny day, that's worthless. It's actually worse than worthless because you are feeding the grid when there's plenty of utility scale solar also feeding the grid. The famous duck curve. The belly of the duck means that the solar in the middle of the day is worthless. But right now in California, you get full retail value for every excess kilowatt hour that you feed the network, regardless of whether the network wants it or can use it or can absorb it or whatever. Now that regulation may change next year. So regulators are critical to what happens and what kind of innovations make sense in this industry. Electric vehicles, people talked about it. The gentleman from Ernst & Young said it's 8 years, 10 years, 18 years in different parts of the world. I think it's going to happen a lot faster than you think. Again, in California, our governor wants 5 million electric vehicles by 2025. So at least in California, it's going to happen. And again, the gentleman after me who's from Norway will tell you that I think 50% of electric or cars sold in Norway today are electric. So some places it's happening faster than other places. And of course, the cars may drive themselves, and there's a lot of interesting things about what that may mean. All right, so you are now gone from a consumer to being a prosumer. What is the next step? Well, the next step is you can become a prosumager. You just add storage to a prosumer. Why would you do that? Well, maybe the regulation changes and the grid is no longer going to pay you for that blue portion. That might be one reason. In Australia, they changed the rules, so you get wholesale market price, not retail price. So many consumers in Australia all of a sudden found out that the excess kilowatt hours is not going to get paid as much as it used to be. So what is the thing they're going to do? Well, they're going to look into storage. And if you believe that the cost of storage is going to decline the same way the cost of solar panels did, then these things might become quite attractive. And Mr. Elon Musk, who's doing all kinds of interesting things and occasionally gets into trouble, he's built a massive factory in Reno, Nevada, which you see in this picture. Chinese companies are building many of these, so there's going to be tons of storage. So you put the pieces together, and what you get is essentially what was the cover story of Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago. That was the title of the article. New electric company, your home. And the article basically said, yeah, zero net energy homes are here. This house looks like any other house. It's a $700,000 zero net energy home near Las Vegas. It has solar panels on the roof. So if you build a house to be more or less like a refrigerator, where no heat comes in or leaves the house, you need very little energy to become zero net energy. And people mentioned this law that was passed a couple of months ago in California by the California Energy Commission, which is one of the, we have more than one regulator in California, but this one sets standards for energy efficiency and things like that. So they actually adopted this regulation, which has been on the books for several years. So homes built in new residential homes starting in 2020 have to meet this new standard. And it's happening. You know, this is the headquarters of Apple. This operates as a microgrid, produces more power than it uses. This is the National Renewable Energy Lab, which more or less operates as a zero net energy, except when they have the supercomputer, which uses more power than it does. But the whole concept that you can make a building into a net producer, or at least a zero net kind of a company is catching on. This is a Spanish company. Professor Arcos might know more about it, but they produce the windows that produce power. This is a new university building in Washington, in Seattle, which the entire exterior will be covered with basically energy-producing panels. I was at a conference where somebody was selling these kinds of panels. You don't have to have these ugly black things to produce power. They come in different colors now, believe it or not. Windows that change property, blocks, these are solar blocks. You can build a wall, and they have concentrated little solar gadgets, and so you can build the entire walls of buildings, or sidewalks for that matter. They're very sturdy. And so this is the concept. You put the pieces together, and you get essentially a house or a building that does all those things. This is Tesla's version of a future home. Solar shingles, electric car, a solar storage in the garage. This is another company called Sunflare, which also produces shingles. Now, people say that within a few years, these shingles will cost more or less as much as standard rooftop material. By the way, these are much more elegant. I mean, who wants to build a roof and then put panels on top of it? Why not just make the roof to be entirely solar? And when we talk about innovation, people are now thinking about different ways of connecting the dots. There's a company in Palo Alto called Aurora Solar. And they say, basically, give me your address, and I will tell you if solar panels make sense for you. So Queen is concerned about electric bills in the Buckingham Palace. So she has nothing better to do. She puts in Buckingham Palace, click. So this goes to Aurora. Aurora picks up an image of Buckingham Palace and does some analysis and sends a proposal back to the Queen saying, here's, dear Queen, you can put panels on this side of the roof. We have looked at the solar installation in London and the rates, and you can get your money back in 3 years, or whatever the number is. These things are not science fiction. You can get these kinds of quality maps of individual roofs or entire neighborhoods by sending a drone. There was a drone looking at us at lunchtime today. Those drones can produce extremely accurate maps of neighborhoods in Cartagena, and you can sit in your office and design where's the best way to put solar panels on the roofs. By the way, the zero net energy that is in California sometimes is actually, there are places that are even more stringent. This is a city north of Los Angeles called Lancaster, and they have a solar ordinance. So for every square foot of living space, you need 2 watts of solar panels, or else you don't get a building permit. So in this particular community, you can see that builders are building massive number of homes. And so since they passed this regulation, these builders just put panels on every roof. So the minute you buy the house and move in, it already has solar panels. All the buildings have solar panels. So regulation matters. Whether we like it or not, whether it makes sense, whether it's cost-effective, we can argue about those things. But in this industry, regulation really matters. Okay, so what is exciting? What do we do with behind the meter and all these things? Well, there's a lot of exciting things. And innovation, we are limited by our ability to think about what innovation is. If somebody asked me, give me a phone that has a built-in camera, I would have thought of something like this, right? It's a phone with a built-in camera. Well, we ended up with something a little different. We all carry one of these, right? And we take photos. I don't have a camera anymore, and I'm sure you don't either. So there's a lot of innovation that is looking at changing these fundamentals, and I'll just, in the remaining few minutes, I'll just talk very briefly about a couple of these topics which I find particularly interesting. One that I find super fascinating, I think it's extremely profitable, is basically platforms. Now, we're familiar with platforms, let's say Uber, for example, essentially is a platform, right? And Uber is extremely profitable because any city you go, you can get mobility by dialing up on the platform, essentially. But many other examples, this is an example of flower ordering business, FTD, for example. So if you order flowers for your, on Mother's Day, and you pay $100 for a bouquet of flowers to be delivered, FDT or equivalents essentially get something like $25 to $30 of the 100 is charged by the platform operator. And when you think about it, what do? They do nothing. They basically sit there and bring different pieces together. But very, very thick margins in terms of, and another example, another number I'll give you. A couple of weeks ago, Uber announced that it was going to go public. And it's valued at $120 billion. Now, if you add the market capitalization of General Motors, Ford, and Fiat Chrysler, it doesn't add up to $120 billion. So platforms are extremely powerful, and as I don't have enough time to give you examples, but there are many ways that people in the electric power sector are beginning to develop ways to kind of monetize the platforms. The other one that people have mentioned is virtual power plants. And again, given the limited time, I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you go to the website, for example, for this one company called Next Kraftwerke, which is a German successful virtual power plant. So what they have is a group of 5,000 plus participants who collectively have 4.5 gigawatts of flexible demand or generation or storage. And Next Kraftwerke can basically, based on using the prices on the market and price signals, can manage that portfolio of assets. And there are many other companies like them who are coming to basically do this. So the aggregation of behind the meter is what I think is one of the most exciting things that is going to happen. Microgrids, people mentioned, I'm not going to dwell on it. Just a very few words about storage, which people talked about. The problem in the future is going to be very, very imminent. You have lots of free sun, free water, free wind, if you have renewables, basically. And if you don't use it when they're available, you lose it. I mean, that is really the fundamental issue. In California, we have solar plants like this. They're 500 megawatts and larger. So on a sunny day, you have lots of free sunshine, and if you don't use it, it's gone. And so forth and so on. So people have talked about the duck curve. So if you can use that belly of the duck, you have plenty of free electricity in the middle of the day, which currently we don't exactly know what to do with or how to utilize. And then you have the peak in the evening when the sun is already set. So one form of storage would be to store it in the middle of the day and then move it 4 hours in the evening so that you can cover the peak. So obviously things are not as hard. This is the actual duck, not the one that was predicted. So actually we arrived in 2016 to what was predicted to happen is 2020. So change is happening a lot faster than many people had anticipated. And I'm going to skip some of these, again, with the interest of time. So basically, storage allows you to clip the peak and cover the the valley. And there's lots of technologies, storage does not have to be batteries. There's lots of ways of storing energy. Okay, so to wrap up my presentation, what do I want you to remember, if you remember anything about what I said? First is the question which I don't have the answer for. These are all questions, by the way. What is behind the meter? Well, there's billions of devices around the world. If you look at any country, any network. So these are, people have invested billions of dollars in these assets. And when you look at how we utilize them, whether it's an electric vehicle or a heater or a cooling device or refrigerator, motors, whatever, they're infrequently used, not integrated, and poorly utilized. Most of the time they sit idle. So there's a lot of wasted investment behind the meter which we have not even thought about using properly and efficiently. What can be done with these? As I gave you some examples, by aggregating, because looking at individual customers is probably not cost effective. But if you aggregate lots of customers, I think economics looks much better. And the last question is how? And why haven't we done this already? Well, the answer is it's very difficult, to be honest. And I talked to many of startups who are in that space, and the last quote is basically one of them told me, the transaction costs will eat you alive. We haven't mastered this art of figuring out how to put, in the case of California, let's say 700,000 solar roofs. If somebody had the data and had access to all those solar roofs, to get that transaction cost low, to be able to monitor and optimize when those are generating and how to store it and how to optimize is not a trivial thing. But that's what keeps people like me interested in this topic, and hopefully we can figure out better ways of going forward. So I don't know if there are any questions or time for questions, or should we wrap it up at this point? Thank you very much for your attention.